Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I recently finished up my PhD in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. And, I'm sure there's not much else going on today in the United States, both athletically nor politically, that everyone's in the mood for some biomedical science today, right? I'm being sarcastic, of course. Almost absurd for me to even mention it, maybe even offensive to anyone from the United States. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that today is an almost spiritual moment in the country. And I'm referring, of course, to the fact that today is Groundhog Day. So it's one of the most important days in the lives of every American every year on the second day of the second month, regardless of what's happening in the country and in the world. Every American turns their eyes to a small woodland critter in Pennsylvania named Punxsutawney Phil. We look to him as sort of like an oracle. There are other groundhogs, but none as important as Punxsutawney Phil. He reveals to us how many more weeks of winter we can expect based on whether he sees his own shadow. And he's basically always right. So, it's like one of the most meaningful cultural traditions in the United States. Oh, yeah. And then I've also heard that there might be like a football game or something on TV later. But since the Eagles aren't playing, it's basically a meaningless and uninteresting event that's not worth your time. Okay, so what is worth your time? Well, I can't tell you for sure. But at least in the moments before the Super Bowl, there's a story that's been brewing about a kind of like an iteration on a family of viruses that's caused some concern in the past. Since I felt compelled to look into this story, because I have like a 1-year-old daughter crawling around and more importantly, just pointing everywhere into everything, I figured it might be a topic worth considering before we all dive into the Super Bowl. So I'm talking about a story that you might have seen associated with the word coronavirus. And, you don't have to worry that the coronas you're going to drink later on tonight have any problems or will infect you with anything other than potentially a hangover, even if you add a lime, as you almost must. And so when people use the word coronavirus, they're referring to a group of viruses that all share some features, and particularly their overall structure that's sort of composed of a bunch of nubs along the surface of viral particles that sort of look like a halo when imaged using electron microscopy. And so that's why they're called coronaviruses. Corona basically translates in Latin to crown. And so this is a family of viruses that has a sort of halo-like structure. And so if you have no idea what I mean when I say something like overall structure of a virus, when it comes to viruses, they come in a bunch of shapes and sizes, from things like long cylinders to like microscopic versions of the things that look sort of like the giant machines in the Matrix that were managing the fields of humans in the machine batteries. And I know that probably sounds a bit like an exaggeration, but so here's an electron micrograph of a bacteriophage. So you can see there down in the bottom corner there, which is a type of virus. And here's a snapshot from the Matrix. You can sort of see the structural similarities there. I wouldn't be surprised if perhaps they even based it off of what bacteriophages look like. And so anyways, a virus is just a tiny little particle that can only replicate itself by exploiting the pathways, the biological pathways, that typically enable a life form to exist, from bacteria to plants to animals. And so back to coronaviruses. So I keep saying that this new coronavirus is part of a family of viruses because this most recent coronavirus outbreak is from a new strain that's, again, part of the family that includes other viruses that have caused other somewhat recent outbreaks. And so to give you an idea of how this naming system has worked in the past and how it's working right now, this current virus is being called the 2019 novel coronavirus by the World Health Organization, or WHO. And so, other outbreaks of coronaviruses have had similar naming structures in the early stages of the outbreaks, and then they got, more sort of descriptive names. And so you might remember SARS, for example, or severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus. Boom, boom. And you can see that here. That's an electron micrograph of the SARS virus. And so there was an outbreak of SARS between 2002 and 2003 that resulted in nearly 800 fatalities in 17 countries from just over 8,000 total cases. And then so years later, the source of this infection was ultimately traced to horseshoe bats that live in the Yunnan province of China. And so according to the NHS in the United Kingdom, there haven't been any further reported cases of SARS since 2004. And so another member of the coronavirus family is MERS. And so you can see MERS here. which it had been referred to as novel coronavirus 2012. Similarly to how this current outbreak is being named, right? And, perhaps you can get an idea of why the structures of the virus might have inspired the naming, due to that sort of consistent presence of the little nubbins along the that surround a sort of center of the particle. And so while SARS peaked between 2002 and 2003, MERS was first reported in 2012. And while both China and the United States also had, reported cases, many countries in the Middle East were also affected. And so, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, and so on. And so, and the first reported case was in Saudi Arabia. And so as a result, it became named or described as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome related coronavirus, or MERS. And a study suggested that the virus likely arose between 2007 and 2012. Okay, so back to this new coronavirus. Just like SARS and MERS, this new coronavirus causes respiratory symptoms. And also, like SARS and MERS, this new coronavirus is thought to have spread through some combination of bats and or other mammals to humans. And there's also some suggestions that it may have jumped from animals to humans via some of the what are referred to as wet markets in China, particularly since the patients who suffered from, who were infected by the virus, all had some kind of connection to the seafood market in Wuhan, China, where there's a high density of people shopping for fish and meat. And, there's butchered meat along with live fish and animals all in one dense space. So it's sort of like a hotbed. So different people seem to present different symptoms and severities. In other words, symptoms can be from mild to severe. And so, what looks like anything from a runny nose, sore throats, coughing, and fevers, and so on, to more severe manifestations of those symptoms. And so, as of the last few days, nearly 14,000 cases of infection have been recorded in over 300 fatalities. And so in China, nearly 60 million people are currently being restricted from traveling. And so, to start, it's worth noting that the World Health Organization, the WHO, has declared this new coronavirus to be a global health emergency. And at their recent press release, the Director General of the WHO notes that there are now 98 cases in 18 countries outside of China, including 8 cases of human-to-human transmission of the virus in 4 countries: Germany, Japan, Vietnam, and now the United States. And so Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, and I've struggled to pronounce his name, but he's the Director General of the WHO, who, for anyone that might be interested, refers to himself as Dr. Tedros, or Tedros. So he also notes that so far we've not seen any fatalities outside of China, though, things changed relatively rapidly, and that was as of a couple days ago. And the majority of the cases outside of China have been in people who have had some kind of travel history to Wuhan in China, or at a minimum, they've had contact with somebody who has had travel history to Wuhan. And so at least part of this concern has been visualized by Reuters. And what they did is they compared how rapidly this new coronavirus has spread compared to SARS and MERS, those past versions of coronaviruses. And so, boom, boom. There, you can see the graph there. And so, they note that this new coronavirus has infected more people within weeks than SARS did in months and MERS did in a year. That while there's still quite a bit we have to learn about this virus, the velocity of the virus's spread seems to be rather high compared to the other major coronaviruses we've tracked, at least these sort of potentially life-threatening ones. And so a primary concern is that, while the virus has been largely contained to a few countries, how the virus could spread in countries with healthcare systems that have access to lower resources remains unknown and potentially threatening. And so in China, within the Hubei province, of which Wuhan is the largest city, which you can see here, I think. Boom. There you go. There's a map of China, and the little red sort of splotch is Wuhan in the Hubei province. So over 50 million people, and I've seen higher numbers than that estimated, are being prevented from traveling by the government to try and confront the spread of this virus. And there are reports of the Chinese government building hospitals within like 6 days, like entire hospitals, and some pretty wild video footage. So they are definitely responding, and responding in more ways than one, and we'll get to that in a second. But the U.S. has raised, from the perspective of the United States, the U.S. has raised its travel advisory to the highest level, meaning that they're recommending completely avoiding travel to China, at least for the time being. And then soon thereafter, Australia enacted the same travel policy, basically. And Vietnam has barred almost all flights to and from China. Japan has barred entry by people who'd visited the Hubei province within the past 2 weeks or had passports issued in the Hubei province. Again, that's where Wuhan is. And then Taiwan is applying a mandatory 2-week quarantine from passengers entering from the coastal province of Guangdong. And evidently Russia is starting to evacuate Russian citizens from the affected regions of China. And so overall, like, this travel and data analytics company indicated that almost 10,000 flights have been canceled since the outbreak, which is pretty remarkable. And so there's an article in The Lancet that estimates that over 75,000 people have been infected as of January 25th of 2020. Which sort of seems to imply that perhaps the Chinese government may be underreporting the statistics of the outbreak, but that is sort of that they're using kind of modeling and statistics to kind of predict, based off of what we know about this kind of virus, how rapidly it was spread, and it's not like any kind of like reporting on the Chinese government. So, a challenge regarding testing people for this virus is that even presenting zero symptoms doesn't ensure that a person isn't carrying the virus, because the test that's used is only accurate when patients do present symptoms. And, the problem there is that there are reports that the virus can be transmitted by carriers of the virus who don't exhibit any symptoms. And so, according to an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, also a highly regarded medical journal, a woman traveling from Shanghai to Germany ended up infecting 7 people, despite the fact that she personally showed no signs of infection. And so the largest case of this new coronavirus, the latest case of this new coronavirus in the U.S. has been reported in Massachusetts, and it's the 8th in the U.S. and the first on the east coast of the U.S. And so this guy is in his 20s. Most importantly, he recently traveled to Wuhan, China, which is thought to be the sort of, again, the epicenter of the spread of this virus. And as of late last night, there's a report of a patient in New York City who's being tested for the infection with, this new strain of coronavirus. And so the first fatality outside of China was reported in the Philippines, and he was a 44-year-old man who was a resident of Wuhan who died after developing severe pneumonia. And then the health secretary of the Philippines said that, while his symptoms had stabilized and evidently had started improving, that his condition then deteriorated very rapidly in the last 24 hours before he passed away. And very late last night, the Philippine government banned non-Filipino travelers from arriving from China, Hong Kong, and Macau. Okay, so that's the sort of like state of affairs globally and domestically with this new coronavirus. And a few, very lovely people contacted me on Twitter, particularly since I have, a 1-year-old daughter, suggesting that I get us some face masks to try and prevent or protect us from infection. And in fact, I'm not the only person to have received this advice. Major medical supply stores in the United States and Canada have been reporting shortages of face masks due to this concern, which would be particularly problematic because, in clinical settings, in hospitals and so on, that's where, potential exposure would be the highest among people who are responding to potential cases of infection. And so they need the face masks. And by and large, most people in the United States don't. And to speak to that, Alex Azar, who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And that's like a very, very large part of the government under which, groups like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health, which is what funds like my kind of research, they all fall under Health and Human Services. And I don't say that because, we don't oftentimes talk about HHS, but it's a very, very important part of the government. And so Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, has been named as chair of a task force responsible for the president's response to the outbreak. And he said that face masks aren't particularly effective. And so Azar said that the risk to any individual American is extremely low. And they say instead of recommending, focusing on being like, instead of, trying to get face masks and wearing them all the time everywhere, it's probably better to be more fastidious about, like washing your hands and avoiding touching your eyes and your nose and your mouth, particularly when in public areas, because that's likely how this virus is transmitted. And so, that said, the WHO, the head of the emerging diseases and zoonosis refers to infectious diseases that can spread from animals to humans. And that's what has been the case for a lot of, SARS, MERS, those are past examples of coronaviruses, and now quite likely this one as well. And her name is Maria van Kerkhove. Kerkhove notes that it seems like this spreads via the respiratory system, transmitted via sneezes and coughs. And so, but it's not like you have to be in pretty close contact for you to catch this from somebody sneezing or coughing. So the WHO recommendations reflect what Alex Azar, again, the Secretary of Health and Human Services here in the United States, recommends. Focus on making sure you wash your hands. And, by the way, I've seen how some people wash their hands, and you just got to make sure that you get your fingers involved in the washing, not just your palms. Another tip is to sneeze into your elbow, not your hand. That's sort of the polite thing to do is to cover your mouth when you sneeze, but I think a lot of people use their hand, and it's better practice to sneeze into your elbow. And then there's also a misconception that antibiotics might help treat this kind of infection. And I think that's pretty common among people who, just get sick in general. They think that I just need to get an antibiotic to kill this thing. But because this is a virus, antibiotics really won't help and may even be counterproductive, given that, there are beneficial bacteria that inhabit places of our body, like our gut, that can be targeted by any antibiotic that you might take. And so rather than antibiotics, vaccines are our main firepower that we have against viruses like this new coronavirus. And so it actually turns out that in response to the SARS outbreak, again, in the early 2000s, there had been an effort to develop a vaccine by a group at my old graduate institution, Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. And so Dr. Peter Hotez, who's kind of like an immunology and vaccinology guru, really, really brilliant guy. I believe he's an MD, PhD. Who also actually, just as an aside, happens to look sort of disarmingly like Bilbo Baggins. If you ever see a picture of him, perhaps you might agree. So he's been, or after the SARS outbreak, he'd been hoping to get some funding from the government to develop a vaccine. But as the SARS outbreak sort of died down, interest in developing such a vaccine died down as well. But fortunately, some progress had been made by their group already. And so it turns out that if it turns out that we'll need a vaccine, they might be able to fast track sort of production. And so there's also, by the way, some private sector groups that are gearing up to produce vaccines. And so, for example, there's a group just outside of Philadelphia that just got a multi-million-dollar grant from a group here at the University of Pennsylvania, also in Philadelphia, to develop a vaccine in collaboration with the sort of historic Worcester Institute, which is on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. So this is a very Philly-centric group here. But And fortunately, the Chinese government, and this is sort of unprecedented, the Chinese government posted the genetic sequence of the virus in the middle of last month, the middle of January. And that company near Philly said that they've already created a vaccine derived from that genetic sequence. And so, just by the way, this same company, which produced a vaccine for the Zika virus in 2016, you might remember, that concern mostly in sort of the southern United States and tropical areas, equatorial areas, spread by it's thought to be spread by mosquitoes. This same company had produced a vaccine for Zika. And it's mostly because of an innovative technique that they're using to produce vaccines that are based on viral genetic sequences as a sort of starter point. And so as a result, and all viruses are essentially very, very, very simple genetic instructions, sequences of, of the same things that compose our genome, A, T, C's, G's. It depends if it's DNA or RNA, but, broadly speaking, they're all just very, very simple sequences of genes. And so as a result, because they're using this new platform, they can be quite a bit more nimble, or quite a bit nimbler than past efforts to produce vaccines in response to outbreaks. And so, in the United States, I haven't seen any indications that this is really a substantial concern that warrants, anything other than just washing your hands. And particularly washing your hands if you visit anywhere with a lot of travelers or cities that have a lot of travelers. And so, given its rapid spreading, though, it's just going to be something that these agencies will keep their eyes on. And, honestly, the scientists and physicians that do this work at organizations like the WHO or the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, they're doing it primarily because they care about preventing the spread of diseases like this. I think there's a misconception that, they're making tons of cash, and they're not making tons of cash in these positions. And, very often they could be earning quite a bit more by doing something else, working in the private sector. They're there because they're devoted to the missions of these organizations. And, also they have to be pretty sharp to ascend to those positions. So, we have some of the most brilliant people in the country keeping an eye on the spread of this coronavirus. So I just figured it might be worth discussing the story, given that it is one of the major biomedical stories in the news that isn't, politics or, the other major thing that's happening in a few hours, at least in the United States, which is the Super Bowl. And so just before, we start the live half, I have to once again apologize for, being groggy. My daughter seems to be transitioning from multiple naps per day to just one nap per day, but it's sort of staccato progress. It means that her sleep schedule is basically impossible to predict at this point. And it also means that once again, I was up super late last night. So with that little caveat out of the way, there's already some questions on YouTube. So why don't we focus on that before we do Twitter. Okay, so this is why I'm not drinking any of the Coronas that my friends will inevitably offer me today. Ironically, horseshoe bats are unlucky, apparently. Yeah, that's true. I can't remember if I mentioned, but it is thought that this new coronavirus likely spread. Oh, I did. Yeah, spread with some combination of bats. Bats are a sort of a typical vector. They very frequently are the thing that spreads zoonotic viruses. But then, there's some speculation that perhaps it was some other organism, maybe not even a mammal, the consumption of that organism that might have caused it. But I think the most compelling explanation is, and also, of course, Corona beer is not going to, spread the virus. But the most compelling speculation of the origins of this virus, and I mentioned this earlier, was these wet markets in Wuhan, in China, which is where the disease is originating, because there's just so many organisms, densely put into one place, and the hygiene isn't, necessarily tip top in these places. And so you have butchered meat, and fish, in the same area as livestock, oftentimes chicken, densely in the same area with a lot of people. Another interesting, angle on why this might have spread so rapidly now, because it's not like those wet markets haven't existed in Wuhan for many years, is that because the price of pork is one of the most popular kinds of meat that's consumed in China, has gone up so precipitously recently because of the sort of friction in trade between China and the United States. Pork has become extremely or much more expensive in China. And so as a result, people are probably turning to other alternatives rather than pork. And so perhaps you just had a higher probability that somebody was going to encounter, either fish or chicken or something that happened to be infected with the coronavirus, or was able to pass on the coronavirus. Okay, hello. I too am trying to catch and spread. Any tips? I'm not quite sure what you mean. Sorry about that. I'm going to my local Chinese takeaway and asking them to sneeze on me. Oh yeah, that'll be a great vaccine. No, so there's no indication, there's no reason to believe that Chinese food in the United States would have any such problem. It's more the environment that was these wet markets in Wuhan. And by the way, this is not nailed down certainly the origin of this virus. It's just some speculation, because given the presence of these markets in Wuhan and the rapid spread. Okay. That's a lovely idea. Personally, out in the woods at nighttime to catch me some good old bats. We'll be going public with lots of cuts on my face later. Scuffed many, MUA. I'm not sure what you mean by that. I'm sorry. Animals can infect humans. Humans can infect other humans. Can humans infect animals like dogs, cats, etc.? Yes. Yes. The short answer is yes. I saw some discussion. Actually, I think it was on the WHO website, where people were concerned, should I be concerned that my pet, my dog or my pet cat might cause an infection? And there's no reason to believe that there's any cause for concern there. It really does. Of all the things we don't know about this virus, it does seem pretty sure that this is originating in Wuhan, China, and it's really the greatest risk of spread is either if you travel there or recently traveled there, or if somebody in your family or one of your friends or whatever has, and then you come into close contact with them. And what's tricky about it again is that people don't necessarily have to present symptoms to be able to spread the virus. And, I'm sure there's going to be some really interesting biology there to determine why it is that some people respond so poorly and some people don't even present symptoms. Just Googled. That's rude. Okay, what about the professor who's recently arrested? I'm not sure what you're referring. If you're referring to the like gene editing story in China, the CRISPR story, I haven't seen any stories that have been any arrests made of scientists in relation to the coronavirus. But I might have missed it. I mean, this is a very rapidly evolving story. I stopped washing 9 days ago. Why have I not gotten it, Anthropoid? Can you explain why I should fear a dumb beer virus? Well, once again, it's not necessarily it's not going to be spread through the Coronas that you're likely to drink during the Super Bowl. Can I get the virus faster by having unprotected male-to-male intercourse in public areas? So that is a way that people can spread virus. But the coronavirus doesn't seem to be particularly sexually transmitted. I mean, it would be interesting to know whether or not these coronaviruses can be spread as sort of STD, but that does not seem to be the primary mechanism by which people get infected. Okay, so watch the lady killers. Well, I'm not sure. Okay, is it any numbers in percent of what kind of care the corona patients get, like just a bed, oxygen aid, respiratory aid? Or what is it for the normal flu? Yeah. So there have been some stories. So basically, it presents largely like a really, really bad flu. And they treat the symptoms. Because again, there is no cure for a virus like this, as is the case with many viruses. Fortunately, there is a sort of fast-tracked production of a vaccine should that be necessary. We're not even sure that it will be necessary. But, once again, it is just the rate of spread that is sort of causing people, in biomedical science to sort of think along these lines, because it's just spread so much more rapidly. This red line here is the spread of this new novel coronavirus compared to, SARS, which spread, less rapidly, and then MERS, which spread quite a bit less rapidly. This one is spreading just super rapidly. And the potential for people who are infected to then travel to other parts of the world where healthcare resources are lower, it could potentially exacerbate that spread and expedite it. So care for patients. Yeah, so it's primarily just respiratory, and so it's difficulty breathing, sore throat, those types of things that you would associate with that, any basically respiratory virus. The problem, however, is that for some people the symptoms can become rather severe, and in that case it's like caring for somebody with rather severe pneumonia. I think there's a misconception among a lot of people that pneumonia is like its own like virus or something, and it's not. It's just a description of symptoms that develops within the lungs as a byproduct of essentially any infectious pathogen, bacteria, virus, even fungi, that can cause that kind of severe reaction. And so it's just caring for them, helping them breathe, and limiting the worsening of symptoms. And I haven't seen any sort of like quantitative comparison to how people with this virus are being treated relative to like other severe respiratory illnesses. But from all the descriptions I've seen, it's pretty similar. Okay. All right. So why don't we start the live half? Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I've recently finished my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in neuroscience. I study addiction and anxiety, the neurobiology of those things. And just now on YouTube, I talked about this, the story of the spread of this novel coronavirus. And that we're at a point where we can have a pretty good idea of sort of where its origins are, at least globally, and the sort of nature of how it's transmitted, and then addressing some of the misconceptions regarding like the care, the strategies to care for yourself or protect yourself that I've seen out there. Okay, opinions on CBD and what's a better major, biology or chemistry? Well, biology, of course. Now, I love chemistry. Organic chemistry was actually one of my favorite classes that I had to take as an undergrad. Is that still up? Okay. But they're just fundamentally different disciplines, right? I mean, you're asking fundamentally different questions, and generally speaking, chemistry majors and people who end up getting a master's or a PhD in chemistry tend to go into industry. Nothing wrong with that, but you're not sort of asking questions about the universe, or about consciousness. Biology, you can also go into industry, biotech and pharma or whatever, but it's just you're more sort of it's a discipline that remains more driven by pure curiosity and the pursuit of knowledge. Okay, and then what was the other thing? Oh yeah, CBD. So CBD, for anybody that's not familiar, is cannabidiol, which is the sort of the lesser studied, but now recently more prominent component of cannabis that, lesser studied than the perhaps more infamous active ingredient of cannabis, THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol. So CBD, cannabidiol, is thought to exert most of its pharmacological effect outside of the central nervous system, and it is thought to be less psychoactive than THC. Now, there's a lot of sort of pseudo information out there about the differences between cannabis strains that are high in CBD versus those that are high in THC, and there's a lot of dispensaries and places now where you can just like legally buy pot that make very strong claims about how much THC versus THC versus CBD is in their cannabis. And the reality is they really, by and large, they just do not have the analytical chemistry resources to actually quantify those differences. It's pretty expensive to do that. So they're basically, generally speaking, speculating on those ratios. But so CBD is thought to be less psychoactive. And as a result, and there's been interest regarding its potential clinical utility now for several years. And perhaps the strongest kind of example of potential clinical utility is that it can help reduce the frequency of seizures in people with epilepsy for whom other treatments just haven't been very effective. And this is, there are cases of even children who are able to reduce the frequency of seizures through the use of CBD, which is very meaningful. So, my personal perspective on CBD, and that is just one example. There's a lot of anecdata, again, the weakest form of data, but it's not meaningless data, that CBD is helpful for some people with problematic anxiety-associated conditions. There's anecdata that suggests that it helps people go to sleep, helps with things like restless leg syndrome that people believe that they have. And so on. And so that's all great. I personally like to sit back and wait for more rigorously conducted science, clinical trials, before I sort of jump on any kind of train like that. That said, it won't surprise me if it does have a bunch of clinical applications beyond just that specific case of epilepsy. My concern with the very rapid rise in interest in CBD is that there's a lot of claims that are being made about it that just have not been verified. And so, that there's claims and this is true for cannabis generally speaking, and I do appreciate and understand why folks that are advocates for cannabis take this strategy. Because it does have some potential, clinical utilities. But the problem is that when you're claiming that, one molecule, CBD, can treat everything from multiple sclerosis to, cancer to sleeplessness, you're getting into a territory where you're making claims that just cannot possibly all be true. And then it sort of does a disservice to the broader effort to, confront the fact that cannabis ought not be prohibited in the way that it is in this country. It shouldn't be a Schedule I drug. I can go into my own personal perspective on cannabis, but that's sort of my concern with what I see in how people talk about CBD. But apart from that, I'm sort of skeptically optimistic that we're going to see more potential utilities of CBD. Oh, another thing that's worth noting is that there really haven't been many severe side effects associated or reported that are attributed to CBD, which is very meaningful. I mean, that's a very important component. Side effects are a very important component of any kind of agent that you use to ameliorate human suffering in any way, right? And so that's worth noting. Okay, it's just the common flu. I assume you're referring to the coronavirus. That's actually not the case. They're actually completely separate, different kinds of viruses. The flu is named after the influenza virus, very rapidly evolving virus. That's why we have different sort of versions of it, different strains every year. This coronavirus is more closely related to past coronaviruses that had then been named things like SARS or MERS. And the sort of concern with this new coronavirus is that it's spreading very, very rapidly, way more rapidly than both SARS or MERS did. And there are sort of already cases outside of China, Wuhan, China, in the Hubei province, it's sort of west of the coast. It's kind of an inland province of China. There are cases outside of China now that have been reported, and some fatalities. The sort of the ease with which it can be transmitted, even by people who present no symptoms, that's also a concern. But as I noted on the YouTube, and by the way, you can find the YouTube by typing in something like Ian Neuroscience Anthropoid or something like that. I sort of set the stage of the kind of state of affairs globally for the coronavirus, and then also some of the ways by which we're going to respond to this. Okay. Let's see. Okay. I'm not like these morons that side with Communist Party in China and saying that it's nothing. I'm just kidding. It's a bioweapon. It's not a bioweapon. And in fact, I watch your scopes because you say ameliorate. Yeah, right. Attenuate is another habit of mine, habit word. Yeah, so it's not a bioweapon. And by the way, the Chinese government has done, a couple of things that are kind of unprecedented. The most notable of which being they've released the sort of the genetic sequence of this virus, which would inevitably happen eventually, but it would take more time because, of course, there are just so many cases in China, over 11,000 now, than there are outside of China. But why that's useful, and that's not something they've ever done in the past. And why that's useful is that there are new platforms to develop vaccines far more rapidly that base the vaccines on the genetic sequences of viruses, right? Rather than, isolating the virus and inactivating it or the various sort of older school strategies. And by the way, that company is in Philadelphia, or just outside of Philadelphia, collaborating with Philadelphian other entities like my beloved University of Pennsylvania. And then another group down in Houston, Texas, where I used to be, Baylor College of Medicine, Dr. Peter Hotez, his lab had already made some progress to develop a vaccine to SARS, but then as the spread of SARS kind of died away, so did the funding for vaccines for SARS. But so as a result, we're pretty well prepared to respond with vaccines if need be. But at this point in the United States, there's just really not much evidence that you need to be very concerned, and you certainly shouldn't be rushing out and buying a bunch of face masks. While understandable as that is, because there are reports of shortages from medical institutions in both the United States and Canada. And if clinical responders to potential cases of coronavirus don't have their face masks, that's how a disease can spread, right? Rather, you should just focus on washing your hands, particularly when you're, in public places, like airports and so on. Okay. How does the brain process regulated oxycodone over long-term use? Warrior class. So I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean by regulated oxycodone, but over long-term use of oxycodone, it's very similar to long-term use of essentially any opioid, and similar to long-term use of most recreational use drugs. And that is that the brain over time adapts to the chronic presence of the drug such that it changes how the brain is responding to the drug, so that the brain sort of looks like what it would have looked like had it never been exposed to oxycodone in the first place, right? So by neuroplastic adaptation to reattain homeostasis would be the sort of buzzwordy way to to phrase that. But so, what the manifestations of that is that the brain will have different levels of opioid receptors, for example, or dopamine receptors, a bunch of receptors that are all altered, that experience altered signaling when exposed to oxycodone. It can change the number of receptors, right, that normally bind neurotransmitters, but can, at least some of the receptors, bind the opioids like oxycodone. It can change the synaptic connectivity between different brain regions over a long period of time. And so as a result, that's why when you stop taking oxycodone, this is not just true for oxycodone, it's true for alcohol, nicotine, cannabis. Once you remove that molecule from the equation, from the system, then all those changes are still in place. And so that's why you have that post, acute withdrawal phase, that severe withdrawal response, particularly to opioids. And it basically, that will persist until the brain becomes accustomed to the absence, the chronic absence of the drug. And of course, that is a major reason for why folks can develop chemical dependence and addiction if they are so predisposed. And it's worth noting when it comes to drugs like oxycodone and opioids, most people who are exposed to these drugs do not develop addiction. Most people prescribed oxycodone do not become addicted to it. And we know that there is such a thing as a genetic predisposition to addiction to a variety of other drugs, quite likely opioids like oxycodone included. We have tons of evidence that indicates that's the case for nicotine and for alcohol, and a good amount of evidence to indicate that that's the case with opioids like oxycodone as well. Okay. Let's see. Should I trust my brain to take SF straight plus to bet on the Super Bowl? I can't tell you. I'm no expert there. Since the Eagles aren't playing, it's not even worth your time, frankly. Okay. Is there an age group which male, female, more likely to develop mental issues? That's a super interesting question, and the answer is yes. Now, it depends upon the specific kind of condition. They have different sort of typical windows of manifestation. And so, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, they somewhat more frequently manifest during adolescence, just after adolescence, and there's an interesting reason for that. So as we begin puberty, essentially, as we enter adolescence, the brain is remodeled very substantially. A process called synaptic pruning occurs. Synaptic pruning is sort of what it sounds like. It is the removal of some of the synaptic connections between neurons, sort of like you would prune a topiary or something. And that happens in everybody, and it's a healthy thing. It's intended, or it's not abnormal. But the potential issue there is that this process is genetically regulated. And it's also, of course, regulated by your experiences, before the pruning occurred. And so that is one of the theories as to why, particularly schizophrenia, tends to manifest in that time, is that for most people, that synaptic pruning it's just part of development. It's part of maturation. But in some cases, if the synaptic pruning process, is influenced by a certain gene that you've inherited, or, a severe childhood trauma, that synaptic pruning process will change the trajectory of your development, causing something like schizophrenia. Now, of course, there are other sort of brain-related developmental conditions that typically manifest much earlier in life. And these are things for which there's likely a strong genetic component to it, rather than purely, or arguably purely a genetic component to it. And so, those will tend to manifest early in life. There's some interesting nuances here, though. So, for example, autism. It's thought to have a very strong genetic component to how it manifests. And of course, autism spectrum disorder is a very broad and diverse range of severity, functionality, and so on. But genetics are thought to. My daughter's back from a walk, by the way. Genetics are thought to play a very, very significant role in determining whether or not somebody will develop one of the autism spectrum disorders. Now, Rett Syndrome is a condition that has been thought to be in the spectrum of autism spectrum disorders. Very recently, and that's because it would be among the most severe versions or iterations of autism, and that's because a lot of the symptoms are very, very similar, except for a couple. First of all, it tends to only manifest in females. There are some cases of Rett syndrome in males, but they are definitely the very, very dramatic minority. It's also unique in that it is a monogenic condition, meaning that one specific gene is altered to cause Rett syndrome, and that's MECP2. Anyway, so what's interesting about the distinctions between Rett syndrome and other sort of similar conditions is that the sort of developmental course is very different. So rather than presenting symptoms of autism very, very early on, some of the classic symptoms in young children is they will tend to make eye contact a little bit less frequently, or quite a bit less frequently. Their sort of social interactions is a little bit different compared to folks without it. Rett syndrome, the typically girls, develop pretty much normally. And there's no overt, obvious sign that there's something different about their brain. However, and they even begin to develop language. They can begin to vocalize and say words. But then very rapidly, at around the age of 2 or 3, there's a very, very rapid decline in their language capabilities. And there are more severe manifestations of Rett syndrome. And so it has this very interesting developmental trajectory that's a byproduct of how the brain develops and the role that MECP2, the gene that causes MECP2, is the role that it plays in the development of the brain. Okay, you mentioned that this is on YouTube. So you mentioned that brain diseases tend to show up when you reach adulthood. Now, is it possible to get it when you're in the middle of your life, and how to prevent it by then? Interesting topic. So is it possible to develop something like schizophrenia? I'm just using that as the example. It's sort of like we've learned a lot about the relationship between genetics, the environment, and a specific, brain-related condition, psychiatric condition, schizophrenia. And so it's a, sort of like we've learned a lot about addiction via studying cocaine, right? So yes, one can develop schizophrenia later on in life. You don't, it's not exclusively during adolescence or just after adolescence. Broadly speaking, there's some sort of precipitating event that will, a highly adverse experience can precipitate it. Also, in some folks, exposure to certain drugs can cause a sort of conversion from just one bout of, psychosis to schizophrenia. And one of the very few components of cannabis that, is just worth acknowledging is that there does seem to be a higher percentage of people who develop schizophrenia after being exposed to cannabis than other drugs. Other drugs can also precipitate or at least contribute to the development of schizophrenia, but cannabis does seem to be uniquely associated with that. Just an interesting component. By the way, it's a very small minority of people who are so predisposed. But yeah, so, environmental exposures later on in life can precipitate it. And then, of course, there can be like seizures that adults can develop, particularly after traumatic brain injury, and exposure to certain combinations of drugs in particular can cause seizures. But in terms of preventing them, I'm not aware of any sort of like universal behavior that you could pursue to reduce the likelihood that these things would happen. Oh, and then of course, more sort of other psychiatric conditions like depression or generalized anxiety disorder, those can definitely come along later on in life, again oftentimes as a byproduct of exposure to adverse life experiences, or traumatic brain injury can also be involved. All right, weed stops seizures. So that I did note that in the beginning somebody brought up CBD. And so, yeah, there is evidence that CBD can reduce the frequency of seizures in people with epilepsy, particularly in those for whom other treatments have not been successful or minimally successful. But that's not true for everybody, so it's not sort of a panacea for seizures. But it is, one of the many reasons that cannabis ought to be legalized. It not only would help those folks for whom it might be helpful in reducing their seizures, but it would also enable folks like me, neuroscientists, basic academic researchers, to study it more. Because as of now, it's very, very difficult to study cannabis. Okay. Acid microdosing. So that is a topic that I've been sort of preparing now for weeks. But then, this coronavirus story evolved very rapidly. And, last week it was this report of a certain kind of chemical that was present in the municipal water sources of a bunch of cities throughout the United States. So I will go into greater detail on microdosing probably next week, unless something major happens. But for anybody that's not familiar, microdosing, the notion is that, somebody is essentially administering themselves, as though it were like a supplement or something like that, a very, very small fraction of a typical dose of a drug like LSD or psilocybin. And so these are psychedelic hallucinogens, sort of most closely associated with the hippie generation, but not exclusively. And this particularly rose to prominence in the sort of Silicon Valley area. And the sort of motivations for why these folks do it is they report that they feel a sort of emotional stability, a greater creativity, greater motivation to, and productivity, like a greater motivation to do their work in creative ways. And, you know, it's worth noting there have been some scientific studies of microdosing, but very, very few. And most of them, or at least the one that's coming to mind right now, was done in the Netherlands. So without going into those details, my own perspective is that this is a family, and, you know, theoretically, any drug could be microdosed, right? It doesn't have to be a psychedelic hallucinogen, but that is the sort of family of drugs that is most typically associated with microdosing. My own perspective is that the pharmacologies of these drugs is very broad, right? And the way that it interacts with the primary signaling system in the brain, that it interacts with, the serotonergic system, the serotonin signaling system, and the particular receptors with which these drugs typically interact, the 5-HT2A receptor. The serotonin signaling system and the 5-HT2A receptor are involved in the regulation of a broad swath of our consciousness. Everything from, you know, mood and cognition, which is, you know, evidently the main motivation for why these folks engage in microdosing, but also sensory systems, the sort of sleep and appetite, and just like such a wide variety of our biological systems that it just strikes me as sort of risky, right? And because there haven't been any sort of like rigorously controlled clinical studies of microdosing, I personally would just hesitate to participate in essentially what is an experiment. Another problem, particularly with acid or LSD, is that, you know, LSD is dosed in the microgram dose range. So, you know, a drug that you might be familiar with, Xanax or alprazolam, is dosed in the milligram range. And so, you know, 5 milligrams is a heavy dose of alprazolam or Xanax. LSD, you know, it's like 100 micrograms, and that's like a minuscule amount. And so essentially these drugs, or LSD in particular, has to be dosed volumetrically, meaning that it's put into a solution, into water, and then that's why then it's classically dropped by a dropper onto small pieces of paper, referred to as blotter. And so the problem here is that there's no way to know what the starting concentration of LSD in its liquid, when it was, aqueous, when it was in liquid, there's no way for you, a consumer, to know how much LSD is on any given blotter paper or in some, solution that you might have obtained. And therefore, there's no way for you to know if you're effectively microdosing by, cutting a piece of paper. A similar challenge arises with psilocybin in magic mushrooms. Different batches of mushrooms can have different concentrations of psilocybin. And so there's no way to know if what a microdose for you in your batch is compared to what I'm getting in my batches, right? And so those concerns are just sort of troubling for me. When you can't control the dose of a drug, particularly drugs that are as volatile and diverse in their activities as psychedelics, for me that's sort of a it would give me cause for concern. Okay. So that was a long little conversation there. What kind of long-term effects do marijuana smokers need to be made aware of? Okay, what they need to be made aware of. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. We can talk about some of the long-term effects of cannabis use, but I like to caveat this kind of a conversation by saying the long-term effects of cannabis compared to most other legal, conscious altering substances, most notably alcohol and tobacco, seem to be far less severe. So in other words, for somebody that's smoking cannabis or pot, for most of their life, they're less likely to develop a lot of the deleterious effects to health that hardcore drinkers, or really just people who have drank alcohol imbibed alcohol for long periods of time. And then, of course, people who smoke tobacco for long periods of time. By the way, there's a new story about tobacco and e-cigs and this new kind of e-cig that I think is interesting if you guys want to talk about. But okay, so that said, no drug is without its downsides, right? There's I can't remember who said it. There's no free lunch in biology, right? If a drug is altering your state of consciousness, it's interacting with your brain is going to respond to that interaction, particularly over the long term. And so when it comes to cannabis, the most obvious is that you do develop a chemical dependence, meaning if you stop smoking pot after you've been smoking a lot for a long time, you're going to have a withdrawal symptom or syndrome. Now, that withdrawal syndrome is less severe than other drugs that are legal to take in the United States, most notably alcohol, where the withdrawal syndrome from alcohol is potentially life-threatening. And that's true for tobacco. Nicotine is like infamously difficult to quit. But you still will have a withdrawal syndrome from cannabis. For some people, it seems to be much more severe than others. There's probably some interesting genetics there to explain that, but those genetics I do not have not been enumerated. Now, so let's get to perhaps the most nitty-gritty and tangible. So there have not been any studies that demonstrate that there are permanent changes to the brain after long-term cannabis use. I've never seen any studies that demonstrate that. There have been, and that is not the case for many other recreationally used drugs. And I'm specifically talking about recreational cannabis use, not, folks with epilepsy and so on. That's a different calculus that they're, engaging in, because the seizures themselves are potentially damaging to the brain, right? So when it comes to long-term alcohol, there can be permanent changes in the brain. Same goes for long-term stimulant use, amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine. So there's not a lot of evidence that there's permanent changes in the brain as a function of cannabis exposure. However, there are studies that do show changes in brain anatomy, but very gross, meaning like large-scale changes after long-term cannabis use. And specifically, perhaps the most kind of widely referenced is a study that wasn't perfect for a variety of reasons, but they, the data they report are still meaningful, and that is that the ratios of gray matter to white matter were shown to change after long-term exposure to cannabis. Gray matter, when people say gray matter, they're referring to neurons, specifically the cell bodies of the neurons. White matter is the sort of the insulation of the connections between neurons. So it's white because it's a lot of fat and that sort of insulate those connections, sort of like the plastic that wraps your cell phone cord. And that fat appears to us as white. And so, changes in the ratios of those two parts, anatomical parts of the brain, indicate that the brain is changing, and those changes, if not permanent, would be pretty long lasting. So there's that. And, apart from the sort of some of the minority of folks for whom, or who might be genetically predisposed to responding quite unfavorably to cannabis, just, upon first exposure, with, a psychotic episode or an anxiety attack, panic attack, that I discussed, just a few minutes ago. Apart from that, I just think it behooves us to compare apples to apples, right? And not treat cannabis as though it needs to be perfectly benign and have no negative effects on health for it to be even considered to be legalized. Whereas I could walk down the street and drink enough alcohol to end up in the hospital and potentially die, right? Okay. Research shows male chronic marijuana smoking is linked to high chance of miscarriages. I've not seen that evidence. There are some studies that suggest that cannabis use can affect sperm count. But again, that's true for essentially all drugs. That's true for getting bad sleep. That's true for using the jacuzzi, right? When you're trying to get pregnant. By the way, when you're in your 30s and you're trying to get pregnant, nobody tells you that it's actually a little challenging. As you can hear, we successfully had a baby, but when I was in high school, I thought like if I like winked at a girl, she would get pregnant. And so, it was like, okay, don't take such long hot showers. Like you do all those things to increase your chances. But anyways, yeah, so that's true for all drugs and poor diet and so on. So that is not a specific critique or a critique that's specific to cannabis. Yeah, God, it's a good point. Okay, so is it fair to say, this is on YouTube, is it fair to say that Tourette's happens to women because of a period circle? God, that's a good point. So I suspect that you are referring to Rett Syndrome. And I am not aware of any evidence that it is uniquely associated with the menstrual cycle or females. So, yeah, I mean, maybe those data exist. I've just never seen that. Yeah. Okay. Basically, you can overdose on everything, on anything, even water. So how to be safe? Yeah, I mean, well, that's true. I don't know that I would call drinking too much water an overdose, because water doesn't really have a pharmacological effect. And I think, it's probably obvious what my perspective is on like the state of drug regulation in the United States. But despite my perspective on that, I think there are some drugs that just there's no good reason for them to be widely available. Like, we have fentanyl already. Fentanyl is responsible for driving this, unprecedented increase in opioid overdose fatalities in the United States. That's contributing to a reduction in life expectancy in the United States. Fentanyl, I think in 2017 was responsible for like 30,000 of the over 70,000 drug overdoses, which is wild. Now, I'm not suggesting that fentanyl ought to be made illegal or eliminated, but the notion that the FDA then approved sufentanil, which is an even more potent opioid than fentanyl, is like, I just don't see the justification there, apart from the fact that a different company was going to make sufentanil than the one that makes fentanyl. And so, it's that for me is where, specific propensities for overdose, of specific drugs is worth considering. And, yes, you can drink too much water and hurt yourself by, disrupting your salt balance. It's actually primarily the nervous system that you have to be concerned with, because, where sodium ions, potassium ions, and calcium ions is very relative to neurons. It's very, very important to their healthy function, and with just too much water, that can be a problem because you could eliminate a lot of it. So that's true for you can eat too much of a given food, you can eat too much of a vitamin that isn't water soluble, so it accumulates too high. But drug overdose is, I think, just a different category of concerns. I have a family member that is constantly going back to the hospital because the shunt is growing. Oh, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Okay. Should I bet on the 49ers or Chiefs? I would bet on the Eagles next year. What are your thoughts on using psilocybin mushrooms to treat depression? Yeah, so that's an interesting topic. Wait a second. Let me make sure. No. Okay. Weird. There are some studies that have evaluated psilocybin in particular for the treatment, particularly of depression that could come about as a function of end of life, like terminal cancer. There was a study, I think, that was done at the Langone Medical School at NYU that showed substantially positive responses among people with terminal cancer. And I think there have been, or they were preparing for a clinical trial of psilocybin for other kinds of psychiatric conditions. I don't know. I can't remember what the status of that trial is. But, a similar-ish drug, MDMA, has been shown to be beneficial for people with PTSD. And so, yeah, I mean, I am excited that there is now a sort of broadening of the scope of, basic academic neuroscience and translational science, or, let's say medical science, to categories outside of the only categories that we use of drugs that we use today as medicine. So like SSRIs, the sort of frontline treatment for depression and other psychiatric conditions, by the way. And they're very, very helpful for a lot of people, but they're not very helpful for a wide margin, right? They're not as effective as, a drug could potentially be. And they all essentially share a lot of the same pharmacology, fluoxetine, escitalopram, or, let's say, Prozac and, Lexapro or, Paxil.
I don't know that.
Well, I do. That was the echo. Anyway, so they all have very, very similar pharmacological action. And so while it is true that some people respond better to one of these SSRIs or SNRIs than others, they're sort of iterations on the same theme. But now we have investigations of potentially ketamine as a potential treatment for severe treatment-resistant depression. Again, these let's say psychedelic amphetamines like MDMA or Molly or whatever you want to call it, psilocybin. And then other, treatment modalities like transcranial magnetic stimulation. So yeah, I am very compelled by that. I think it's a great evolution in neuroscience, and it is only growing. And so, yeah. But would I would certainly not recommend, and I don't think any medical doctor would recommend that anybody take psilocybin, anybody self-medicate with psilocybin. While they may be potentially useful in some clinical settings, they can also potentially exacerbate or even precipitate a psychiatric condition. So yeah, I mean, I would never tell you what to do with your own brain and body. But if your intention is to potentially try and cure your depression by using one of these categories of drugs, I think that is not a productive avenue. Your best bet, and depression is a very severe psychiatric condition. Right, rates of suicide in the United States are increasing, and depression is a leading cause of suicidal thoughts. And so it is not a trivial condition just because it's not arising from your pancreas or your heart or something arguably more tangible. Right, it's arising from your brain, and your brain controls everything you do, every decision you make, every thought you have, every emotion you feel. And so yeah, it's not so trivial. You wouldn't try and treat your own diabetes by, eating whatever, horny goat weed or something. All right. Can sex help depression? So, sex, a complete absence of libido or being, having a hyperactive libido can also be associated with these psychiatric conditions. Legit question. Have studies been done on the long-term effects of masturbation on the male brain? I've not seen any studies actually that specifically. Thank you very much for the super hearts. Oh, there's Sherry. Thank you as always very generous. I appreciate it. And Kennedy Ray, I really appreciate the super heart. I've not seen any studies that focus on that question. No. I suspect that most physicians, of which I am not, I have a PhD, I'm a scientist, would only consider masturbation to be problematic if it's compulsive, right? If it's interfering with your day-to-day life and you have sort of lost control over the frequency. All right. No, casual sex works too, as long as you're married. Okay. Impossible. You don't have to be a brain scientist to know this. That's indeed true. That's true. All right. Let's see. You look like Rocky's son, Rocky Balboa. You're not the first person to mention that. Okay. I know pills are nonsense and the pumps might work. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the pumps. But pills are certainly not nonsense, right? Pills are just a delivery system of purified molecules. So yeah, I mean, I totally appreciate and actually sympathize with a sort of broad skepticism of the pharmaceutical industry, particularly recent stories of how Purdue Pharma and the sort of, Insys, I believe was the company whose CEO went to prison for, medical malfeasance, essentially. These companies that were involved in opioid pharmaceuticals, it's thoroughly damaging, I think, to the sort of perspective that the public has of biomedical science, and more particularly the pharmaceutical industry. So I totally share your skepticism, but that doesn't mean that all medications are to be treated the same. They're all very different, and the pharmaceutical industry is just, at least in our current medical system, the entity that delivers medication. But they're an industry just like any other, right? And so they're composed by people just like any other industry. And so it's not the medication itself that's to blame for these problems. It is how they're managed. Okay, how many fingers am I holding down? Well, I can see you're holding 3 fingers down. And clean your room. That sounds painful and taxing. Okay. What color are my socks? You're not wearing socks. Okay. I'm taking vitamin D pills. Let's keep the comments clean and on topic, folks. Thank you for your civility. Oh, wait. Okay. This is serious. You joking? You talking? All right. I know if you get shorts often, would that be a nervous issue? I'm not sure specifically about that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with you. Your diet might be to blame. So we are getting called by somebody whom I've known for a while, at least on this medium, named Sherry. So Sherry, if you don't mind, where are you calling from?
Southern California.
From Southern California.
Plane landed with the coronavirus.
Oh, wow. Okay. So is that what's on your mind?
But that's not why I called. I have an unusual question for a neuroscientist.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Okay, I saw like a talk just the other day where there were 2 people standing on a stage. Wires were connected to one lady's hand and through a junction box to a male on the other side. The girl was able to maneuver the man's hand supposedly through brain what do you call it?
Signaling.
Through brain function. What I want to know is that real, and how far has it progressed? Will we ever get it to where like we can get people to walk with someone else walking?
Yeah, so it's a super interesting topic. Now, if you don't mind, do you know, were there like electrodes that were connected or like stuck onto the hands and stuff? Okay.
Yeah, it was like the kind they use for heart attack people.
Yeah.
They put it on the forearm of the girl to the forearm of the man, and if she moved her fist, his hand would go up and down.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, that's a pretty cool demonstration. So first of all, that is definitely possible. Because the way muscles contract is via a signal that arrives at the neuromuscular junction from the brain. These can be electrically stimulated. And I don't know if you remember, I don't know if they're still very popular. I don't see commercials as often these days, but back in the day, there were these ab trainers that were basically just like electrodes that you'd stick onto your abdominis rectus, your abs, and they would just pulse at a frequency and force you to contract your muscles. Same concept. Now, what this group has done, which is very clever, is to not only, measure when a person is contracting those muscles, which you can measure. I mean, actually, just yesterday, my wife and I went to a wonderful place in Philadelphia called the Franklin Institute, and they have this little demonstration where you just rest your arm down on 3 sort of prongs that protrude and don't hurt you, but they just sort of like protrude into your skin a bit. And as you move your fingers, it can show you the changes in electrical activity at the muscle, right? And so what they've done is clear. Yeah, it is very cool. And so what this group has clearly done is when they measure a signal, electrical signal from the dude's forearm, then they cause a delivery of a signal to this other person across the room. Now, how close are we to using those types of platforms to potentially help people, theoretically with like paralysis? Quite close. So the sort of prosthetics world in biomedical science is one of the coolest. It's always one of the coolest parts of the society for neuroscience because, it's like everything looks like we're, moving towards cyborgs, right?
That's why I keep watching you all the time. I'm waiting for this miraculous breakthrough.
Oh, really? So perhaps this personally affects you. But so, yeah. And so I've definitely seen, so for example, somebody very close to me in my family recently had a pretty severe stroke and lost a lot of the control of one half of the side of their body, specifically their legs and their leg and their arm. And
Yeah.
there's a new device that has come out that it's really intended to help train, because you can, through physical therapy, you can potentially regain that function just over a long period of time. And what this device does is it actually measures potentials from the, electrical activity from the level of the primary motor cortex, as well as, very subtle electrical signals that still arrive at that, those, at the leg and at the arm. And then they sort of amplify it to those muscles that are not receiving enough signals from the brain due to the stroke. And, I think they're marketing it as a physical therapy aid. And for me, I mean, that totally makes sense. And, we're still far away from, you having an implant in your brain and basically just...
Is that almost like a more complicated TENS unit or something?
You'll have to describe that to me.
A TENS unit, like what you put on for a muscle problem you're having, and you put like an electrode on your leg, and you can control from 1 to 10 how much electricity you give that one muscle.
Got it. Okay, got it. Yeah, it is kind of like that. It is kind of like that. Yeah. But in terms of it being widely available to folks who have suffered strokes, or and the damage done to the nervous system by a stroke is quite different from like a spinal cord injury. But broadly speaking, yeah, I mean, they were not just doing sort of like BS, demonstrations. At least from what from your description, that's totally possible, and it's actually kind of a clever science demonstration.
Like the beginning demonstration to entice a whole group of high school students to want to go into neuroscience when they get older.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea. So thanks for calling in, Sherry. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Great, that's all I needed to find out. Thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you later.
Appreciate it. Talk to you soon. Okay. No, sir. Your brain will make yours. Is time travel something we'll see? Well, I am a neuroscientist and I'm not a physicist. And so I would recommend you bring that topic up with a physicist. Although from the conversations I've had with my friends who are physicists, they do not believe that is likely to occur in our lifetime. Although it would be interesting, yeah. I won't just wildly speculate there. So we electrocute ourselves amplified 100 times. No. So it's not like getting electrocuted. It is the delivery of a very, very low current. I mean, you can go to, you've felt a static charge, a static discharge, right? When you've, rubbed your feet on the carpet and then you touch something metal, it's sort of like a little jolt. It's sort of like that a little bit. Different delivery system, but yeah, and it's not dangerous. All right. Let's see. Do you know why Donald Trump doesn't wear glasses? He's got 20/20. Well, if he has 20/20, then he wouldn't need glasses. Can we know your credentials? Yes, of course. So yeah. It should be delivered pretty soon. So pretty soon I'll be able to actually put it probably up there. But I just finished my PhD in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania, and my research focuses on addiction and anxiety, the neurobiology of addiction and anxiety, trying to map out a part of the brain, human brain, that's been on Earth in some animal's brain for at least 350 million years. And we know that because we see this specific pathway, the pathway that I study, not only in other mammals, other primates, like chimpanzees or bonobos, other apes, the gorillas, but we see it in other mammals like cats and dogs and rabbits and mice and rats. But then you can even go further down the phylogenetic tree to our more distantly related brothers and sisters of the animal kingdom. For example, in fish. Fish are pretty distantly related to us. Our last common ancestor with fish was a very long time ago. In fact, about 350 million years. So yeah, this is a very ancient part of the brain. And generally speaking, ancient parts of the brain are very weird relative to newer parts of the brain, and very dense and very involved, very diversely involved in a bunch of different aspects of our consciousness. So the pathway I studied has been shown preclinically that if we can target this brain region during withdrawal from nicotine, alcohol, opioids, it's actually the densest collection of opioid receptors, mu-opioid receptors in the entire body, we can potentially attenuate the severity of withdrawal, potentially just completely get rid of it, helping people to quit, smoking or drinking or, so on. And my project was to map out its functional contributions to anxiety, to the anxiety that all organisms feel. And that's what I did. The movie Scanners was cool when the guy's head exploded. I agree. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is sort of the motivation for why I picked the silly screen name before I knew I was going to try and use the screen name to communicate with people. Anthropoid. But yeah, transhumanism is it's a topic that relates to a lot of the things we talk about, particularly when it comes to whole brain-computer interfaces and the integration of technology into the brain. I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and one of the most popular episode series is one that we devoted to Neuralink, and not just Neuralink, but whole brain-computer interfaces as a whole, talking specifically about like the sort of state of the art, state of the science, when it comes to whole brain computer interfaces, the goals of companies like Neuralink. Neuralink is not the only company that's trying to make something like this, but then also sort of forecasting what a world would look like if we were to have these things. The sort of the threats, the potential advantages, potential disadvantages. So you can check it out, Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play, and where all fine podcasts are podcasted. Okay, we're getting another caller. So I've started writing, trying to keep track of this because it's wild how many people I get to talk to, but then I forget where they're from. So if you don't mind, what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there, Evelyn? Evelyn, all right, can you hear me? Looks like we might have a connection problem here. All right. I love transhumanism, but I also am the subject of your research. I suffer from anxiety disorder. So I, oftentimes for people who are in neuroscience, you have to be very passionately invested in neuroscience, and very frequently that passion is derived from a personal relationship with the given topic to which you are drawn. I personally have never been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or anything like that. I do believe I have sort of elevated baseline levels of anxiety. But folks in my family have been diagnosed with, psychiatric conditions in general, and addiction. And that is part of my motivation for why I want to help contribute to the effort of trying to understand the nuts and bolts of why it is that we do the things we do, we think the things we think, and feel the things we feel. What do you know about mental health? Well, I study mental health from at the most basic scientific level, right? So, physicians engage mental health by trying to attenuate or alleviate the suffering that arises from psychiatric conditions, right? They are armed with as much information that they can bring to bear in that effort. I am involved in the efforts to try and expand that base of knowledge so that physicians can be more for two reasons. First, that physicians can more effectively and competently reduce suffering, but then also so that we understand what I think is the coolest 3-pound mass in the entire universe. That's your noggin. You're not good at dealing with us bozos in the comments. Not at all. I am a total bozo. Make no mistake. I just happen to have the privilege of studying the brain, which is very cool. I'm a very lucky man. I could corrupt him like Palpatine. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Also, I smoke. So, what's interesting is that you're not alone. In fact, there is a tremendous enrichment of people who smoke cigarettes among people diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And the thought is that, nicotine, unlike many other drugs that are sort of recreationally used, it's not like there's a tremendous therapeutic application for tobacco, although there are some very interesting correlations that suggest that there is some potential clinical motivation, or there's some clinical justification for targeting the signaling system with which nicotine interacts, the cholinergic or acetylcholine signaling system. And that is that people who smoke seem to develop Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease at a lower rate than the general population. Pretty weird, right? I mean, of all the many things that are bad about cigarettes, that is one that is like interesting and sort of vexing. And it, for, you know, I think mostly in like the 80s was the primary motivation for a bunch of pharmaceutical companies to try and, you know, explore the cholinergic system for the treatment of specifically Parkinson's disease. And unfortunately, no medication was generated by that. But anyways, yeah. So people with psychiatric conditions smoke cigarettes at a much higher frequency than those outside of, you know, those who are not so diagnosed. And it does indicate that in some way the cholinergic or acetylcholine system, again, nicotine binds acetylcholine receptors, conveniently named nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the brain. They're some of the most, they're one of the diversest families of receptors, meaning there's, you know, among the greatest number of nicotinic receptors, or the greatest number of receptors of one sort of category, you know, serotonin, acetylcholine, GABA, glutamate, neurokinins, and so on. The nicotinic acetylcholine receptor family is one of the widest. Serotonin, I think, is the widest, with I think 14 receptor subtypes. And by the way, a lot of those serotonin receptors are thought to have evolved from nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Anyways, it is thought that the cholinergic system likely regulates mood and psychiatric conditions in general. All right, so a question on YouTube. Do you believe that medication is required to successfully tackle most depressions and anxieties? So I don't really see it that way necessarily. So, you know, I think that we are fortunate to live in a time where we do have those tools available. You know, psychiatric conditions are among the hardest medical conditions to treat, right? Because the brain is far more complicated than pretty much any other organ in the body. And of all the organs in the body, we understand the least about the brain. We understand quite a lot about it, so don't you know, be fooled into thinking that we don't know anything about it. We know quite a bit about it, but as a result, you know, we're still sort of at the foothills of this mountain that we're trying to scale, of trying to understand the relationship between the brain and, you know, and mood and the mind, and then competently intervening via the development of drugs. So, you know, I don't think it is necessary to effectively treat a depression or anxiety. That, you know, I don't think it's necessary that you need a medication to do so. You can effectively do it with psychotherapy as well. But boy, they can be handy tools in making those treatments more effective. And so, you know, generally speaking, the best outcomes are derived from a combination of a pharmacological intervention, a medication, and a psychiatric or psychological intervention, psychotherapy, you know, psychodynamic psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever it might be. So yeah, I don't think one is inevitably better than the other, but I think we're fortunate to have both at our disposal. Okay, gosh, I'm missing a lot. Doctor said you can do therapy, but it will take longer. Yeah, right. It can help expedite, you know, the efficacy of the therapy. And like the original sort of concept or expectation for how a drug like Prozac or fluoxetine would be used, and I'm just using that as a representative of like the whole family of SSRIs, SNRIs, was that it would be used for a short period of time, you know, after the week and a half to 2 weeks that's necessary for its therapeutic effects to be realized or to manifest. But then, you know, you wouldn't use it in perpetuity. You would use it during therapy until you were cured. Now, there's no, you know, strong and fast rule about how any of these tools ought to be used. But that was the sort of original concept, was that it would enrich other treatment. You're wearing your watch on your right arm. This is interesting. So I'm ambidextrous, sort of. I'm kind of like I write with my left hand and I do everything else with my right hand, like play sports and stuff. Give people the finger. But yeah, I don't know. It just feels natural. I have worn a watch on my other hand. It doesn't feel right. So it's, you know, it's probably just early on. I just, for whatever reason, I wonder if my dad is the same way in terms of right-handed, left-handed. I can't remember which hand he wears his watch. I wouldn't be surprised if I just started wearing it on this hand because I saw him doing it. Same here. Yeah, it's an odd thing to consider, because like, so my daughter's about 1 year old, and she is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from being able to walk now. She's taken her first steps, but she hasn't, like, you know, continued on. Yes, I live in Philadelphia. But I can sort of see, like, so for example, when we're reading a book, right, and I ask her to turn the page, she, generally speaking, always favors one hand. And I think it's her left hand. She will every now and then use her right hand. But it's like in those moments, I'm wondering, like, you know, are these specific motor behaviors the ones that will ultimately determine her motor dominance? And we don't have an answer to that question. We do know a lot about how it is that right-handed versus left-handed comes about biologically, but certainly the environment plays some role. All right. I can be a moderator if you need one. Yeah, contact me on Twitter, @_anthropoid. You can do it through the app. Yeah, I mean, for sure. You know, I hope that most folks, as I have, sort of developed a kind of expectation of the dogs of the internet, right? The internet is just an amplification of the human experience, and there are bad parts of the experience, good parts of the experience, people that want to destroy things, people that want to participate in things. So yeah, I hope people aren't too distracted by the dogs of the internet here. Really, do patches, gum, vapes work as well? Shames that cigarettes are dangerous. Yeah. So if anybody's actually, my first peer-reviewed like academic publication was about nicotine or smoking cessation. And as of fairly recently, the best outcomes were derived from people who combined a nicotine replacement, substance, be it gum. They had at the time inhalers, vaporizers, which now are just e-cigs, and lozenges and the nicotine patch. If you combine that with one of the partial agonists, and then you taper down the nicotine replacement as you still have the partial agonist. By the way, the partial agonist is a drug like varenicline. I believe the trade name is Chantix. And basically what that drug does is it sort of tickles the same receptors that nicotine tickles, but not as potently, let's say. And so you get a sort of a small dose of the effect. You don't go into full-blown withdrawal. And so, like, in terms of like the best outcomes have been a combination of those things. Oh, another one that's been used is bupropion, which is not pharmacologically different, but I think it's called Wellbutrin for people who are trying to quit. Zyban, I think, is when it's marketed for smoking cessation, and it's a SNRI. It's not a nicotinic partial agonist, but some combination of like either Zyban or Chantix with the nicotine replacement substances, and then you taper the substances. And by best outcomes, I mean like they followed people for many, many, many months after they tried to quit, and the longest abstinence rates were among people who did that. But there's also, psychotherapy for nicotine cessation. Nicotine is extremely difficult to quit. And it's sort of underestimated because, of course, it's legal, right? And so the assumption would be, well, heroin, oxycodone, those are super addictive, but nicotine is quite addictive. Here it's called bupropion, but I already use it as an antidepressant, so I'm afraid. Yeah, so it's bupropion. It's called Zyban, or Wellbutrin is the trade name it's used to treat anxiety or psychiatric conditions like depression, mood-related psychiatric conditions. But it's the same exact molecule. Yeah. Kratom is becoming very popular and helps wean opioid effects. Indeed, yeah. Kratom or kratom, kratom, some people say. Kratom. It's an interesting substance. It's essentially a tree in which there are opioid alkaloids. Opioid meaning that these molecules seem to interact with the opioid receptors, more specifically the mu opioid receptor, given the nature of the effects of kratom. We can talk about crocodile in a sec. And by the way, the pharmacology of kratom is not, thoroughly enumerated, right? Most of what we know about the pharmacology of kratom is derived from behavioral reactions. And so it is still kind of speculative, but it's almost certainly true that, at a minimum, it engages the opioid signaling system, the mu opioid receptor. But then it also, because, and this is how, a lot of the variations in like strains of magic mushrooms or strains of cannabis can make it difficult to pin down the pharmacology of this plant. There's variability in the effects that people describe when they take different strains of kratom. So kratom is sort of native to like Indonesia, Sumatra, Mali, Bali, and sort of that part of the world, Vietnam, I think also. And depending upon where this kratom is obtained, you can have more sort of like sedating effects, or you can have more stimulating effects. And so theoretically that would be attributable to some difference in the concentrations of the various alkaloids that are present in these leaves. So that's a little bit challenging. But yeah, there's a lot of anecdata of people who were addicted to opioids, highly addictive opioids like oxycodone and heroin, where they were able to stop using those those drugs and avoid the severe withdrawal syndrome that results from opioid withdrawal, and help them quit. And so, it is tempting to suspect that kratom is a healthier alternative to potentially, opioids that present a higher risk of overdose fatality, like oxycodone, of course, fentanyl, heroin, which is, at least in Philadelphia, which is one of the epicenters of the opioid addiction crisis. What is called heroin is very frequently just a little bit of heroin with a little bit of fentanyl, and a little bit of fentanyl goes a very long way. And the dose response curve, meaning like the difference between the effects of a dose that's this big versus this big, is extreme when it comes to fentanyl. It is like a life or death consideration. And so kratom, I've never seen any reports of any fatalities that have been attributed solely to kratom. There was a report, or actually a press release from the FDA, I think now probably at the beginning of 2018, about a year or so ago, that said that they were interested in emergency scheduling kratom because they had seen reports of about 42 fatalities in which kratom was implicated. But even in that same press release, they say that they could not isolate any single case to being caused specifically by kratom. Other drugs were always involved. And so I think it would be great if more, comprehensive research could be done with kratom, because anything that expands what's called the armamentarium, or the sort of pharmacological toolkit that we have at our disposal to address an unprecedented frequency of people dying from opioid overdoses, is inevitably a good thing. And just as we use, buprenorphine and Suboxone, buprenorphine and naloxone, or methadone, potentially kratom could be another alternative. Seldom more. Blade Runner 2049, joy waifu for men. This be negative for society. I don't know what joy waifu for men means. How can we develop our brain using capacity? I'm not quite sure what you mean by brain using capacity. But if you mean like, how do we amplify our intelligence, or increase our intelligence, or various skills, it's to expose the brain to the species of challenge that you're interested in addressing or confronting more competently, like, practicing, in other words. Now, just like in terms of like good cognitive hygiene, particularly if you're concerned that you might develop dementia or anything like that, exposing your brain to solving new problems, learning a new language, reading books by authors with whom you disagree, or you're not sure you agree, learning about the histories of various subjects, learning to play a musical instrument, learning how to dance, forcing the brain to come up with new solutions to new problems is just fundamentally a healthy exercise. And so that is, that's very, very broad brushes, but all right. If you don't do anything, you do become dumb. That's kind of true, I suppose. Or at least you become, it's non-adaptive, right? And if you tend to expose your brain to fewer and fewer new problems, it's not forced to adapt to new challenges. And among the many things that the brain does, it is sort of like an adaptation engine, right? It enables us to, confront new environments, new scenarios, new interactions, and come up with solutions to the challenges therein. How does the brain control the gut biotic production of serotonin? Well, it does not. So yeah, it is an interesting factoid. that is misconstrued, I think, by a lot of folks. So the majority of the serotonin in your body, in your entire body, is produced in the gut. So your gut produces a ton of serotonin. However, none of that serotonin ever makes it up into the brain, or if any does, it's a completely trivial number of molecules. All of the serotonin in the brain is produced within the brain. And so, the enteric nervous system is what we call the nervous system that regulates the gut. It is extremely dense and diversely composed, and it can function independently of a central nervous system. So if you had a human with no central nervous system, so long as you enabled by some kind of medical marvel them to continue, their beating heart and delivering oxygen to the various tissues of the body, the enteric nervous system would continue on happily. Now, how can the central nervous system influence the enteric nervous system? It is through things like experiencing chronic stress or chronic anxiety, experiencing an adverse life experience that causes you trauma, something like PTSD. Things like that. Those are, because it's an indirect mechanism, but via things like inflammatory signaling or glucocorticoid release due to stress, it can basically manipulate the interaction between the immune system and the gut microbiome that inhabits the gut, which will then likely have some indirect influence over the production of various, bioactive molecules in the gut. But I'm unaware, at least, of any connection between like the raphe nuclei that produce serotonin in the brain and the various serotonin-producing neurons in the gut. I wonder if advanced AI bots can make socially isolated, depressed people more happy, like a human. It's an interesting notion. And I don't know that there's an intuitive answer to that, because social isolation is actually a growing concern in the United States and a lot of the developed world, or whatever term you want to use to describe countries of similar sort of human experience. And this is despite the proliferation of social media that enables us to communicate over potentially thousands of miles. And intuitively one would expect that social isolation would be reduced due to that increased connectivity between people, but it doesn't seem to have done that. And there might just be a secret sauce to humans interacting in person with other humans that is intangible, but but very important. Like, it could be the case that just being exposed to like olfactory stimulation of other humans might be a sort of nutritious component of social interaction that you just cannot get delivered electronically. And then so, virtual reality or artificial intelligence, let's say, it could be the case that it might help. It might sort of soften the edges of the cutting effects of social isolation, to extend the metaphor dramatically there. But it could, be therapeutic, but it might suffer from the same, weaknesses of social media. Trash talk show with Austin Powers. What? Okay. Do migraine attacks damage the brain? No, they do not. So there's, like, broadly speaking, like, two categories of headache, and it's type 1, type 2, and like type 2, I believe, is a category of headaches that are brought about by damage to the head, essentially, right? You smashed your head and you have a headache. That is not what describes a migraine. A migraine is, recurring, debilitating, severe headache, but it doesn't arise from damage to the brain. It certainly feels like it's being damaged, but that is because you actually have no pain receptors within the brain. So, somebody could have implanted like a little, robot barracuda in my brain. It could be swimming around damaging everything. And apart from me losing my, faculties, losing my ability to talk or to, think or remember things or see, I wouldn't actually feel it as though, it were doing so elsewhere in my body. So the pain that you're feeling in a migraine is being generated outside of the brain, just outside of the brain, along the meninges, or, or elsewhere near or adjacent to the brain. And that is part of the reason for why a lot of the theories to explain migraine focus on signaling at those areas and not within the brain. All right. Are you aware of any cases where a gut injury affected a person's cognitive ability? That's a really interesting question. So I'm not aware of any specific case studies where like a gut injury, like for example, somebody develops diverticulitis and has a part of their, intestine sectioned out. I'm not aware of any case studies that somebody then developed a psychiatric condition or, schizophrenia or whatever you want to call it. Or whatever any psychiatric condition following that surgery specifically. That would be probably very difficult to prove. But what I can tell you is there is evidence. Hey, what's up, Zaina? Good to see you. There is evidence that when a person's microbiome is the microbiome, meaning all the microbes that inhabit your gut is like a coral reef, and you have a bunch of microbes inhabiting your gut, like fish inhabit a coral reef. Where specific signature, and it's a very diverse distribution of microbes, and it just turns out there's a correlation between a pattern of specific microbes that are present in the gut of people with depression or anxiety-associated conditions. Take care of y'all, coral reef. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. So there's that. I don't know that I would go so far as to call that an injury, but there's certainly, to step back a little bit from that specific topic, there certainly have been correlations between, the biological state of the gut and mental health, psychiatric conditions. Okay, Super Bowl just got started, folks. Don't know why they decided to start it this early, though. Oh, really? I thought it was starting at 6:30. Huh. That's too bad. All right. Yeah. I would only want one wife, but I think we need to save humanity first. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. More water needed. Are there any pros to schizophrenia? Very interesting topic. In fact, it's one that I've been thinking about quite a bit. So first of all, schizophrenia is a very severe condition. And, one can find silver linings there. In terms of creativity, in terms of the way that, folks with schizophrenia see the world. But by and large, the negatives dramatically outweigh the positives. However, schizophrenia can be seen as a kind of the most severe manifestation of a spectrum of mental health or of, let's say, combination of personality, cognition, creativity, mood predispositions, where a less severe relative of schizophrenia is schizotypal. And it just turns out that a lot of the same features of somebody with schizophrenia can be observed in somebody with schizotypal personality disorder, schizotypal disorder. I've seen it called different things, but there's probably is a correct name for it, but in academia, that's what I've heard it described as. And so, as is the case with people with schizophrenia, generally speaking, people who are schizotypal will tend to be socially isolated. They'll tend to engage in professions and stuff that enable them to be a bit more isolated. And so like when I think of somebody who's schizotypal, I think of somebody like Ken Kesey, who he was a member of the Beat Generation. He was sort of involved in the kind of wave of popularization of the use of LSD recreationally in the sort of the predecessors to the hippie generation. He was a writer, of course, primarily poet, I think, more accurately describes him. But he worked in what are called fire towers. So fire towers are these, they're towers. And they're made of fire. Now, they're towers, and they were devised so that before we had the internet and satellite communication and so on, people, their job would be to live essentially for weeks in these fire towers that were 40 feet, 50, 60 feet up in the air above a forest, and they would just watch for fires. That was their whole job. And I think it was set up by around World War I, World War II. And by the way, those fire towers many of them still exist. They're not used for the same reason. And some of them have been purchased by people as houses. And I actually proposed to my wife at a fire tower. Pretty cool. Anyways. So, when I think of somebody who's schizotypal, I think of somebody who would have done that kind of work, right? Where they sort of, they remove themselves from society. And then also, they have, they have different patterns of association, right? where they will tend to interpret metaphors and things like that very concretely, but then also they will have sort of very loose associations between things. And all of this to say, it is folks like these who are, let's say at the, if you were to arrange everybody in a normal distribution, they're on the tails, right? They're the most unique. They have, among the most unique minds in society. But oftentimes these are the folks that have a tremendous influence on culture and cognitive evolution. And hey, Saucy Mona. Yeah, long time. Good to see you. We're talking about any potential upsides of schizophrenia. All this to say, immense creativity, unique perspectives. Oftentimes, I've seen some folks argue that okay, so if a condition, is so deleterious to health that it is, evolutionarily maladaptive, then, oftentimes these things get selected out, right? Because it interferes with one's ability to reproduce. And so they have lower ability to reproduce. And so therefore it just doesn't spread throughout the population. But if there is some advantage to any of these conditions in very specific environments, then they can potentially propagate. So, that the classic example is like cystic fibrosis, or the more classic example is, oh my God, seriously, sickle cell anemia. Man, did not get enough sleep last night. But sickle cell anemia is, it causes anemia and shortens lifespan dramatically, but it also protects against malaria, which is why we tend to see sickle cell anemia among folks from parts of the world where malaria is it's common. It's like sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and like the Mediterranean, southern Mediterranean. And so this specific mutation, this unique mutation, is maladaptive, broadly speaking, in the rest of the world, but it's actually adaptive in that part of the world. Cystic fibrosis, I believe, is the most common genetic disorder that is inherited, and it's very bad. It shortens lifespan. But it turns out that it can be protective against cholera. Another example of this is Tay Sachs disease, which is very common among Ashkenazi Jews. And there's some evidence to suggest that, if one inherits sort of a small dose of what causes Tay Sachs disease, it can be protective against tuberculosis. And so, again, just another example of like a broadly speaking maladaptive mutation that in certain circumstances is actually adaptive. And so when it comes to schizophrenia, I sort of see it in a similar way, where broadly speaking, it's you would rather not have schizophrenia than have it. But in certain environments, having like a small dose of schizophrenia can be very productive, can be very helpful, can contribute a lot to your one social group, and so yeah, that's sort of how I see, is there any silver lining to schizophrenia? Is there any benefit to schizophrenia? Broadly speaking, no. But in certain environments, I think that there's probably some pretty intangible benefits that perhaps explains why we still folks still develop schizophrenia and schizotypal disorder today. All right. That was a long, I was literally thinking about this earlier today. That's why I went off on it. In the dream, my wife gets slayed and gets pregnant by another dude. Then I wake up in anger. That would make me quite angry too. I don't see there's anything pathological about that. Protects against malaria. Yeah. That's, sickle cell anemia. That is sort of the classic example that very clearly demonstrates that there's no such thing as a bad gene. Right? Or, insofar as there is, it's in very specific situations. But what's more important to consider is the way that genes interact with a given environment, right? So, in Canada, one probably wouldn't benefit from having sickle cell anemia, but in sub-Saharan Africa, potentially, right? It would enable you to live for at least long enough to reproduce and therefore propagate that mutation. All right. You got there eventually. Yeah. It's sort of like just by force of will, I remembered those words. All right. Oh gosh, what time is it? 5. I can't remember what time I started. But anyways, all right. So I have a YouTube, and earlier today I talked about the coronavirus and sort of set the stage for the state of the coronavirus globally and domestically in the United States. And I put it in a sort of more historical context than I've seen elsewhere. And so you can see how it's similar and different from other similar viruses. And I've given you an example of how the United States is responding, how China is responding, and like best practices that are recommended by the WHO, or the World Health Organization, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, here in the United States. So you can find my YouTube by doing something like some combination of Ian, Brain, Anthropoid, or something like that. Yeah, let me know what you think. I have a podcast. I'm planning on updating it soon. It's called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher. And once again, where all fine podcasts are podcasted. And I also have a Patreon. And if you are in the position to be able to, I would deeply appreciate any support you might send my way. It's patreon.com/anthropoid. And so hopefully I'll be able to get a little bit more frequent on these various platforms this week. But if not, I'll see you in the same time, same place next Sunday. See you there. If you're in the United States and you watch football, enjoy the game. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. See you guys. Oh, and good night and goodbye, YouTube.